It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce, so I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres Trailer Court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, Big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seem to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack, and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's 30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 220s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back and had just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino. But when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bedbugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench. And when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful.
We'd like to thank our sponsor, Final Thoughts. Final Thoughts would like to give our listeners a 10% discount on their premium package. Wouldn't you like the peace of mind of hearing from your loved ones just one last time? Well, at Final Thoughts, they can... Mark spooled the volume down as he waited for the commercial to end and his podcast to pick back up. He glanced out the window and was greeted by another sign for Final Thoughts. The company was barely a year old, and already they were everywhere. He turned the podcast back up, but wasn't really paying attention anymore. The traffic moved sluggishly around him, like an artery clogged with plaque. He just knew that it would make him late for dinner, and then Lisa would be upset. She hated it when he was late for dinner. The words of the host were cut off suddenly, as his phone chirped and displayed Lisa's picture on the screen. Mark sighed. She was probably calling to ask when he'd be home. She wouldn't be happy when he told her he was going to be late. He'd worked late every day this week, and she had probably made a big surprise dinner for Friday. He considered ignoring it, but knew that would just lead to a bigger fight. He caught it on the fifth ring. "Hey, hun," he said, trying to sound chipper. "Hi, sweetie." Her voice put Mark on edge. They'd been married almost 7 years, and he'd learned how to read her reasonably well in the early parts of the relationship. Her voice was high, unnaturally sweet, and he could already tell that something was wrong. This was the voice she used when she was upset and trying not to show it, when she had bad news but didn't want to tell it. He almost thought he could hear her holding back tears, but didn't want to say so. Lisa, is everything okay? How was your day? Did you make any big sales? That took Mark aback. Lisa wasn't usually interested in his work. Yeah, I made a few big sales. Mr. Copeland said I'm likely a shoo-in for Employee of the Month. That's fantastic, dear. I'm so proud of you. When she said it, there was a slight wince at the end of the word, and Mark could still swear that she was trying not to cry. She was acting strangely. What was going on over there? As Mark sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic, he couldn't help but imagine that someone with a gun was in his house, telling his wife to call him. Maybe someone had died, Mark thought, and she was trying not to tell him until he got home. As the car ahead moved, Mark took his foot off the brake and accelerated forward enough to stop again. Just up ahead, he could see a road worker holding a sign. This was the gatekeeper for a stretch of road laden with roadmen and trucks. This was the source of the traffic, and Mark cursed loudly, realizing that this would take the better part of an hour to get through. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Lisa asked, in that same overly chipper voice that verged on breaking. "Oh, it's road work, babe. Looks like I won't be home for dinner for at least an hour." She made a sound, and to Mark it sounded like a sob. "Oh, I'm sorry, hon. I was hoping you were a little closer. I had something I needed to tell you." Her words broke apart as she spoke, and Mark was getting kind of worried about what was going on at home. "Lisa, is something wrong? You sound like you're barely able to stop yourself from crying. What's going on?" "I promise you won't get mad. I don't want the last thing I hear to be the sound of you mad." Her words sent a chill through him. "The last thing you hear? What are you talking about?" She paused for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully before continuing. "Mark, honey, there was an accident." "An accident? What happened?" A car beeped at him, and Mark jittered forward a little bit. He had expected to hear that someone had died, that dinner was burnt, maybe that there was a bill that had come in and it was really bad. He had thought maybe there was a home invader or a kidnapping plot. He had thought of 1,000 different things, but her being hurt was never one of them. Lisa rarely left the house. When she did, it was always to her destination and back again. Lisa's parents had been killed in a car accident about 10 years ago, and it had all but made her a shut-in. "I don't want to talk about it. Can't we just make our last conversation a happy one? I don't want you to remember me like this after I'm gone," she said, finally breaking down. Mark could hear her crying on the other end, and the sound was too much. When the car beeped at him this time, he ignored it. Mark had already stripped off his seatbelt and was climbing out of his vehicle. The driver blared his horn and yelled at him, but Mark didn't care. He was running up the sidewalk, phone pushed against his ear as he ran for their apartment. His apartment wasn't far from the office, but he always drove because he didn't want to arrive with his suit smelling of sweat in the street. He had always considered the 30 minutes to an hour it took him to get home as his time. Now he just wanted to get home before his wife breathed her last. "What happened, dear? Just keep talking to me." Her voice was becoming weaker, but he craved it like a starving man wants a slice of bread. I was dusting the lights. I dust them every Friday. They get so dirty during the week. I was up on a stepladder, and I guess one of the brackets snapped. I fell and hit my head on the table. I saw the blood on the floor and knew it was bad. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm such a klutz." "Don't be sorry," he said as he ran up the street. People moved out of his way or they were knocked aside. A woman fell on the curb and her angry voice followed Mark as he ran. Mark passed a policeman and the man tried to stop him. He juked around him and kept running. His apartment was only 3 blocks away and he knew he could make it. "I'm scared, Mark." That gave him a burst of speed. Just hold on. I'm almost there," he huffed as he ran across the street, the sound of horns blaring behind him. I feel cold. "Please, stay with me, Lisa," he almost cried, tears dripping down his face onto the phone. He could see their apartment building as it loomed in the distance. The gray facade had never looked better to him, and he knew it was only a block away. He ran flat out, his suit coat billowing behind him, his button-up hanging long around his waist. He looked crazed, but he didn't care. He was going to see her. He was going to save her. He was going to be there for her. "Mark," she gasped. Her voice had become as fragile as glass. I'm here, honey. There's an ambulance outside the complex, as well as several police cars. What's going on? Has someone called for help? Why didn't you say so? I just wanted to let you know my time's almost up. His breath hitched in. Don't talk like that. We'll have more time. I see paramedics outside. They must be here for you. No, they've already come and got me, Mark. He stopped as he watched them roll out a gurney with a black bag on it. The bag was zipped up, the contents not moving. The paramedics loaded it into the back of an ambulance and closed the door. They rolled away without ever seeing Mark at all. You're hearing my voice because I signed up for Final Thoughts. I know you don't like them, but I wanted you to have some closure if something ever happened to me. I remember how much it messed me up when my parents died, and I never got to say goodbye. I've only got about a minute left, Mark, but I want to tell you that I love you, and I'll always love you. Mark stood on the sidewalk as the cold numbness rushed over him. He was hearing her voice for the last time. She was already gone, already dead, and now he was listening to the last words she would ever say. This was grisly. It was a joke. How could they put a time limit on how long he could spend with his wife? Mark, she whispered, her voice a thin edge of dandelion fluff. He swallowed his emotion. This was his wife's final moments. He didn't want them to be meaningless. I love you too, Lisa. I've always loved you. Goodbye, Mark. I love you, she whispered. She sounded happy. The line went dead.
Grandma and I have been roommates for about a year now. That probably sounds pretty weird for a 23-year-old girl to say, but I have to say it's been a pretty great arrangement. My girlfriend and I have lived in the apartment for about 3 years now, both of us deciding that campus housing wasn't for us. Grandma may be sort of a new arrival, but I gotta say, she's probably about the best roommate I've ever had. She cooks, she cleans, doing so despite Regina and I telling her that we don't expect her to, and our laundry always seems to find its way into the closet once the hamper is full. She was one of those hippie types who missed the 60s and is incredibly chill. I don't know many other grandmothers who like to sit on the back porch at night with us and have a beer and smoke a bowl. She doesn't judge me for what most people over 50 would consider an unnatural relationship either, which means the world to Regina and I. She told my girlfriend many times that she considers her a second granddaughter, and the people in the community tell me how cool it is to have someone like my grandma in our lives. Most nights, while we sit on the porch, having a beer or two and passing around some stuff that's not strictly legal here, Grandma would tell us how this reminds her of how she and her friends acted when they were young. My friends and I would sit on the veranda and drink wine sometimes. The nights in Greece are warm, and we used to just sit in our shifts and tease the boys when they came by. It was a marvelous time to grow up. The war was a distant memory, at least for those of us who were young, and life was full of possibilities. Grandma grew up in Greece, missing the end of the war by 3 years, and she often talked lovingly about her time there. She was never very clear about where she grew up, but it must have been near the water because many of her stories involved she and her friends swimming or going to the beach with boys they fancied. She'd met Grandpa at 17, him studying abroad and her waiting tables in a cafe. She said it had been love at first sight, and he'd asked her to marry him once his time in Greece was over. He brought me back to California with him, and to me, it was the grandest place in all the world. She often told us stories from when she was young, and Regina and I usually found ourselves laughing at the antics of her younger self. She and her friends had sounded less like a group of young girls and more like a group of street toughs. Grandma told us how they had done everything from teasing boys into fighting to stealing a scooter and fleeing from the police. If it hadn't been for Great Aunt Sophie and Uncle Martin, Grandma might have been a full-fledged criminal instead of a sometimes rapscallion. They had all been happy stories, at least until tonight. Regina had come home from work, and I could tell that something was off right away. Regina's in nursing school and often has to work in the ER as part of her studies. They pay them for their time, of course, but it's expected that students will pursue jobs in the medical field so they can gain experience. Regina is usually full of stories about how she helped clear the airway of a baby or how she got a patient to tell her that the prescription drug they had taken was more recreational than they'd let on. Grandma and I had already started our little revel without her, and she took the beer I handed her with a shaky hand. I watched her sip it for a few seconds, hands jittering, before finally asking her what had happened. They brought in a lady today. She'd been stabbed over a dozen times, and they said she had no pulse. They wheeled her in on a gurney and asked if I'd notify the morgue that they had a Jane Doe to go back. I nodded. Not your first dead body, babe. Regina shook her head. I turned to get the phone, the paramedics walking away for a moment as a call came in over the radio, and when I turned back, the woman had sat up. It was a little scary, but I thought it was just gas in the corpse or something. I turned back to the phone, and then the gurney started creaking as she climbed off. She went walking up the hall like a ghost in her sheet, and when I started screaming, the paramedics came back in a hurry. It seemed funny to me, a lady in a sheet shuffling up the hallway towards freedom, but I guess it was a little different when you were living it. Turns out she had a very weak pulse, and when she'd come in, she'd attempted to run. Her heart stopped before she got to the door, and she died right there in the ambulance bay. How terrible, I said, my image less funny now. She must have been searching for her killer, just like poor old Victor, Grandma said, patting Regina on the arm. Who, I asked, not sure who this Victor was that Grandma was talking about. Victor Mustrov, she elaborated. He was a handsome young man in the village I grew up in. He was quite a bit older than me, around 22 when I was 13, but he was so handsome. It was a shame what happened to him, but it was even worse what happened afterwards. I leaned forward on the cheap plastic chair I was sitting on and asked her to tell us. She nodded. It's a little scary, though. At least, it gave me a shiver when I was young. As she spoke, her eyes seemed to cloud a little, her mind traveling back over the years and the miles. It all started after Victor's murder. They didn't realize it was a murder right away, of course. Poor old Victor was a carpenter, he and his brother Isaac. The two worked for his father, Marcus, but it was pretty clear who Marcus favored. Victor was set to take over his father's operation when his father grew too old to work, and Victor had let this and his charm go to his head. He was vain, we all knew it, but he was charming too, and his vanity was really no big deal. He dated many girls in the village, and my friends and I were even taken with him. Then, one day, he went missing. We all searched for him, the whole town coming together to look for a favored son. Isaac came with us, saying that his brother had left the job site after saying he had to go do something. We searched the woods and the hills and everywhere around the village, but we couldn't find his car or Victor. He was simply gone. A week went by with no sign of him, but most of us just assumed he had taken after some woman from out of town. Victor was prone to that sort of behavior, but this was the longest he had ever been gone. Isaac went right on working, like his older brother wasn't just gone. Marcus, however, was inconsolable. We saw him many evenings sitting on the porch, sot drunk and weeping openly. Isaac would often be trying to console him, but Marcus wanted nothing from that one. My friends and I changed sides of the street when we walked past Marcus's house, not wanting to get drawn into their arguments. Then, one night, someone said they saw something strange. I heard it around the market first. It was an older woman, someone's grandmother, who said they had been walking home when they encountered someone they thought was Victor. He was staggering on a badly twisted leg, kicking up dust from the cobbles with every shaky step. His clothes, however, looked like the kind of garments a dandy might wear. His vest was filthy. His pants left a trail of water when he walked. I called his name, thinking he might have been in an accident, and when he turned around, I thought for certain I would faint. The hair was wet and lank, the curtains seeming to spin in slow motion, and then I could see the weeping crater that was his face. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and the holes where they had been did little but gurgle and wheeze. I screamed, turning away in my fright to clutch the edge of the fountain, and when I looked back, it was gone. I scoffed at her story as other old ladies clutched their rosaries and told her she was lucky to be alive. Old women often made things up like this, I thought in my youthful wisdom, and went back to shopping. It was likely just some beggar or a scarred-up vagrant. I told my friends about it that night as we sat smoking on my mother's veranda, and we all laughed at how silly she had been. When Julia saw him that night on her way home, it changed our outlook a bit. Julia was supposed to spend the night, but she ran home after dark to get something. She was gone for a little while, longer than I had thought she would be, and when she came back, she was out of breath and sweating, close to hyperventilating. It took us quite a while to calm her down, but finally she told us that she had seen the man from the old woman's story. "It was just like she said," she gasped, her face fearful as she recalled it. "I was going home to get my records, and when I came to the plaza near the fountain, I heard a weird dragging sound. He came out of an alley, and I turned to see his smushed face looking straight at me. I ran as fast as I could, but it seemed that no matter where I went, he was limping close by. Finally, I hid in the market until he shambled away, but I was terrified that he would find me." We consoled her, trying to keep her quiet so that she didn't disturb my parents with such talk, and eventually she went to sleep as her fear began to ebb. The strange, shambling man was all anyone could talk about in the coming days. People saw him walking through the streets, shambling along as though looking for someone. He would always be gone whenever a group came to see him, but the longer it lasted, the more people started traveling in groups. There was a lot of speculation about who it was and what they were after, and some people thought it might be Victor. Chief among them was Miss Treda, a woman believed to be a strega. She claimed that Victor was seeking his killer and wanted to find his body so that they could use cruentation to find him. She had conducted things like this before, offering to help the police if they would let her display the body, but she had been turned down many times. Cruentation was something old that she believed in, and it seemed to associate guilt with the blood coming from a dead body when the murderer touched it. No one really believed in it anymore. It was an ancient practice. And besides, how would you collect everyone up to touch the body? Our town was home to hundreds, and collecting them all would be quite an effort. Most people rolled their eyes at Miss Treda, but I think a lot of them secretly believed that the shambling specter was Victor. When it broke into Marcus's house and scared him half to death, many more people thought it might also be Victor. A few people whispered in the market the next day that the spirit had come after Marcus, and there were some rumblings about checking if he was the murderer. Miss Treda had started offering money to anyone who could find Victor's body. Some young men had started roving the streets at night to see if they could follow the specter back to his place of rest, but it seemed to avoid them as easily as it avoided the constables that hunted for it. This went on for several weeks, and it was very exciting times. People sat and made up wild rumors about the stranger and what it wanted, and my friends and I were no exception. Then one night it all came to an end. I remember being woken up by someone screaming. Our house wasn't too far from Isaac's house, and when I went to my window I could see the corpse as it carried him through the streets. It had him by the front of his shirt, Isaac beating at him as it carried him towards the plaza where he had first been seen. Others were looking out their windows, watching the grim procession as it made its way through the streets. Despite the horror, many of us put on our robes and shoes and ran to see where the shade was taking poor Isaac. As he came into the plaza, it was hard for the crowd to ignore the blood that was oozing from him, his pores excreting this thick and tarish juice. Miss Treda, standing amongst the crowd by then, didn't have to tell them what that meant. Isaac had already begun confessing his sin again and again for all to hear. Upon hearing him confess, it was as though the shade folded in on itself. He collapsed, dropping Isaac and laying dead on the cobbles of the plaza. The constables arrested him immediately, and I watched him beg for forgiveness as they hung him 3 months later. His lawyer drug out the proceedings, claiming that evidence provided by a corpse was not the modern justice that he was about, but the number of people who had heard him confess in the plaza was inarguable. Isaac himself pled guilty, despite his lawyer pleading for him to be silent, and he refused to leave jail until he was led to the gallows. I heard he told people that Victor's shade visited his window every night, and he was afraid to leave the jail, fearing it might come after him. 100 people saw Victor's corpse bleed that night. 100 or more at least, and they all lived in fear of the shade for nearly a month. That was thankfully the only time I saw a corpse walk. Regina and I looked at each other, both of us trying to see if the other really believed her. As I lay here now, Regina snoring thinly beside me, I can say that, whether I believe or not, it's a story that'll follow me for quite some time. I nearly drowned 2 weeks ago, and it changed my life. My family moved out to Mercy Shores recently. It's a little peninsula down in Washington, with 2 hardware stores, a Walmart, and not much else. Mom and Dad grew up in San Diego, amongst the hustle and bustle of city life, and decided they wanted to retire somewhere a little quieter. I had been their last child, a total surprise to both of them at 40. Now that they were 55, they felt it was time to retire and enjoy their golden years. So they moved me 400 miles away from my friends, my school, and anyone I had ever known, so they could enjoy those golden years. We moved into a beach house of sorts. It was a 2-story, the second floor a loft that overlooked the ocean out of a big round bay window. They gave me the loft and took a larger room downstairs with a less spectacular view, knowing I was not happy about leaving my friends behind. I guess my parents were trying to placate me, so I set up my meager possessions that I'd brought with us, the moving truck being a couple of days behind. As I set about finding a home for things, I found myself drawn to the big bay window that overlooked our little stretch of beach. The shore was far from picturesque. Not quite as pretty as the California beaches, Mercy Shore was stony and a little bleak looking. I didn't doubt the water would be cold and clear, but it would also likely have rocks, and maybe crabs scuttling underfoot. There was a tall jut of rock just off the coast, about 50 feet from the shore. I found my gaze drawn there again and again. It looked like nothing so much as a tall throne, fit for a giant. The seat was smooth from many tides. I almost thought I could see a little hollow in the back of the throne. The throne wasn't quite large enough for caves, but there was a narrow fluted passage in the throne's back that would likely fill with water when the waves crushed over it. Those waves woke me up that first night. The crashing of the breakers jarred me awake. I realized that they were so loud because I'd left the window open. As I slid it shut, my eyes were caught by the moon as it cast its glow on the stone throne. As I closed the window, I saw something moving in the water. The lean shape crested up and out of the water like a sea serpent, and as it came up, I could see it was a girl. Her hair was long and silvery and lovely. She ran her fingers through it as I stared at her, and she seemed to feel my gaze as she floated like a specter in the dark water. She looked up at me, her smile wide and inviting, and waved a single pale hand at my window. I waved back, and when she slipped under the water this time, she didn't come back up. When I woke up the next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The next day, Mom and Dad wanted to go antiquing in town. I told them I didn't want to go, and they didn't act too put out by my refusal. It was pretty clear they didn't want a complaining teen tagging along and ruining their trip. I waved to them from the front porch as they left before moving upstairs to relax a little. I sat in the window seat of my new room, reading and watching the waves crash, when I saw some people walking down with blankets and coolers. They started setting up their stuff, and I noticed most of them looked around my age. On a whim, I decided to talk to them. What was the worst that could happen? I slipped on a pair of comfy shorts and headed out. The beachgoers tensed when they saw the door open, but they relaxed a little when they realized I wasn't an adult. I introduced myself and learned that they were Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger. They had apparently been coming to this beach for quite a while and said it was a favorite hangout spot for them. Sorry for intruding. Throne Beach has been empty for years, and the old lady who used to live here always let us play here when we were kids, Matt explained. Matt looked like he'd be at home on any California beach. Board shorts, long brown hair cut in that way that's half bowl cut and half natural, a surfboard next to his blanket, and a smile for anyone. Stuart was tall, gangly almost, with buck teeth and thick glasses. He was very pale, and I got the impression that they had dragged him out from under a rock to hang out with his friends. Kyle and Roger looked like a couple of classic Chads. Snap brim hats, sculpted physiques, gold chains,
board shorts, the works. They slapped my hand when I went to shake theirs and roared with laughter when I looked a little confused. We became friends in that effortless way teens often do. I hung out with him for the rest of the day. We swam, the water was cold and stony, as I had thought it would be, and played frisbee with a big red disc that Roger had brought. I invited them in for lunch, and we sat on the blankets and munched cold sandwiches and chips. The sun was starting to work its way across the sky as we ate. I noticed that mine wasn't the only eye drawn to the big rock out there. Matt was studying it intently as he ate, and it almost seemed like he was looking for something out there. "It's pretty cool," I said, taking a bite of bologna as he looked over at me. "The rock, I mean." Matt nodded. "Oh, Matt just thinks it's cool because he thought he saw a girl out there," Roger crowed. Matt shot him a murderous look, but I was interested. "A girl?" Matt blew out a big long breath. "Well, it happened a few years ago. I was out here swimming with Kyle and Roger, and the waves were a little rougher than I thought they were. We had all been daring each other to swim out to the rock and back. We had all done it since we were young. I was on my way back, and a huge wave crashed over me and drove me under. I kicked my legs and tried to right myself, but the waves kept crashing down. I was underwater, running out of air, and as my lungs cried out, I felt hands catch me. Someone lifted me and swam me to the shore. I was on my knees, hacking up water and struggling for breath. I looked back at the water and saw a girl swimming away. Kyle and Roger came running up then, and when I looked back, she was gone." Kyle snickered, but I was curious. "What did she look like?" "She had long hair, maybe blonde or silver. She looked young. I remember thinking that she was about my age. Her hands felt strong but cold, and I've been keeping an eye out for her ever since. I keep hoping maybe she'll come back." His eyes glazed over a little then, and he stared back at the throne-shaped rock hopefully. I heard my dad honk the horn on his old truck then, and my new friends turned to see my parents coming up the drive. They had some furniture in the back of the pickup. As Dad got out, he called me over to help him move it. I said my goodbyes and went to help, but found all four of them following behind me to my surprise. We had the furniture inside faster than expected between the five of us, and I introduced them to my parents. Mom asked if they'd like to stay for dinner, holding up a takeout Chinese food bag. "I can get some more. The place next to the antique shop smelled so good that I just had to have some." "Maybe another time, ma'am. We don't want to intrude," Matt said. He held his hands up, and I slapped it as he promised that they would see me tomorrow and see if I wanted to hang out. They cleaned up their stuff, and after another round of goodbyes, they hopped on their bikes and rolled into town. Mom smiled. "Making friends already, I see." I smiled back, realizing I had done just that. We sat around the table and ate as they told me about their day. My parents talked about the antiquing, the stores in town had a large selection, and Mom was in love with several other pieces. I told them about my new friends, and they agreed that they seemed like nice boys. I told them how lovely the beach was, and Mom said she had gotten a call from the movers saying that they would be here tomorrow afternoon with the stuff. "Maybe your friends would like to help you set up your room?" she asked. Turned out, they did. I spent that summer hanging out with my new friends. We had moved at the very end of school, and next year I would be starting 10th grade at Mercy Shores High. Matt, Stuart, Kyle, and Roger would be starting 10th grade as well. We had many of the same classes, and as the summer slipped away, Matt proposed one last beach day to celebrate the end of summer. "It's the last really warm day before fall, and we should take advantage of it." It was a great day. The sun was hot, the wind was breezy. Dad had set up a grill and was cooking hot dogs and hamburgers. Mom had found the badminton set, and we were using it to play volleyball. Mom agreed to play with us, to round the teams out, and she turned out to be really good at it. Roger, Stuart, and my mom creamed Kyle, Matt, and I 3-5, and we decided to swim a little after that. We took to the water like a school of fish, and Kyle suggested we swim to the rock. "Come on, Kyle, let's not," Matt protested. "What's the matter, Matt? You chicken?" Kyle teased. "I'll race you," I said, starting to swim for the rock, as Kyle cawed angrily and lit out after me. You don't realize it from the shore, but the rock is pretty far out. It was about 30 feet from the beach, and you just don't really realize it till you're there. I had swum to the rock before, we all had, but it's never the same trip twice. I swam hard, tearing up the surf as I went, and when I got to the rock, my arms were burning. I hung to the side of the rock like a barnacle, catching my breath as Kyle closed the distance. When he was about 3 feet away, I dove back into the water and started swimming hard for the shore. I heard him yell, but I ignored him, paddling hard as I made for my friends who were bobbing near the beach. That was when something grabbed my leg. At first, I thought it was a fish that had just wandered too close, and I kicked my foot out to shoo it. When it wrapped its squishy hands around my leg again, though, it tugged me down with a strength I hadn't felt before. I was pulled under the water, dragged beneath the waves, and as I went below, I felt the air rush out of me in surprise. I kicked out, but whatever had me was fast. It dodged out of the way of my kicks and continued to drag me into the blackness below. I opened my eyes, trying to see what it was, and I was transfixed for a moment. It was a girl. It was the girl. Her hair plumed around her like a halo, and as she noticed me noticing her, she smiled at me. For a moment, it seemed like her mouth was too full of teeth, rows of needles that gleamed in the murky depths. She tugged me down, but now I very much did not want to go. I kicked again, but I was losing focus. I needed air. I was losing consciousness. As the blackness swam up before my eyes, I thought for sure I was going to drown. Then, something grabbed me under my arms and tugged me free. The next thing I was aware of was someone giving me CPR as I coughed and gurgled on the beach. Mom's face swam before me, and she smiled in relief as I came back. I sat up, still coughing, and heard someone in the water yelling for Matt. Kyle was beside me, apologizing profusely as I choked out the last of the water. I looked around and saw that Stuart was yelling at Matt as he dived under again and again, searching for something. I coughed up some water. What's wrong with Matt? Kyle looked out and sighed. He went out to save you. He dove to get you, but he came up talking about a girl he'd seen. He said she had you by the leg, and after he put you on the beach, he went out to find her again. Dad called the festivities shortly after that. Kyle and Roger hauled Matt out of the water, and the four left after saying goodbye and telling me that they were glad I was okay. Matt didn't say much of anything. He looked dazed and confused, and kept looking back at the water as they led him back to the bikes. I knew how he felt. I found myself drawn to the water after that. If I had a spare moment, or even if I didn't, I would sit by the water and listen to the waves. I couldn't get her out of my head, that beautiful creature that had grabbed me. Why had she grabbed me, I wondered. She had seemed intent on showing me something underwater. Did she want me to see something, maybe? Matt started coming around a lot more. Not to see me, not really, but I think he wanted to be close to the water too. I caught him down by the water at night sometimes, sitting by the shore or sitting by the beach. He never brought anything. It was always just sitting in the sand and staring at the water. Dad came out and shooed him more than once, and he told me to tell Matt not to sit out there at night a few days later. He could get hurt out there, and I don't want to call the cops on him for trespassing. That was the night I heard the whispery voice coming from the beach. It came through my window and seduced my ears to wakefulness. I sat up, listening, hearing a returning voice that was much less musical. It was no less familiar, though. When I looked out on the beach, I saw that Matt was on the shore and talking with someone. The someone was in the water, and by the sound of it, they were trying to coax him into the water with them. He looked back towards the road, his bike a shadowy hulk on the street, and then again at the speaker. He said something too low for me to hear, and when they returned to that sweet honey sound, he walked into the water, and I heard him splashing as he dove. I ran from my room and went softly down the stairs. I was worried about him. He was a strong swimmer, but the waters at night were likely dangerous. I came out onto the beach, whispering his name so as not to wake my folks up. I went to the edge of the water and scanned the dark ocean for him, but he was nowhere to be found. He had been there only a moment before, hadn't he? I spent a few minutes searching for him before finally heading inside, thinking maybe I'd been dreaming or something. That was when I heard the voice. "Hello, handsome." I turned back to the water. I'd heard a feminine voice speak, heard it plain as day, but all I could see was the black waves as they churned endlessly. It was dark out there, too dark, and I didn't think that anything could exist out there in that blackness. "Not leaving already, are you?" the voice asked again. It was closer now, and when I looked, I saw a silver-haired girl sitting on the shoreline. It was the same one as before. She was dressed in a green dress, the color of seaweed. Her hair was long and silver and hung wild around her, shimmering wetly in the moonlight. Her skin was like porcelain, so white and flawless, and her face looked like a carved mask made of flesh. Her hands were on her knees, and when she turned, she smiled at me with the most beautiful set of perfect white teeth. She was breathtaking, the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and as she tugged at my legs, trying to get me to sit, I did. "What brings you here so late?" she asked in her whispery voice. I thought my friend was here." "No one here but me and you." Her silvery hair danced in the moonlight as she shook her head. "I saw you the first night I moved in here," I said, not knowing why. She nodded. "I wanted to say hello. Now it seems I have." I don't know how long I sat there, but it was the best night of my life. We talked for hours about nothing at all. She absorbed every word I said, and I basked in her ephemeral beauty. She was a goddess, her skin lacking blemishes or faults, her hair a perfect sheet of silver. We talked until the sun came up, and I remember her looking at it and giving it a little hiss. "Come see me tonight, handsome," she said sweetly. "Wait, where are you going?" "Home. I'll be back tonight." Then she kissed me, and my whole world trembled on the edge of breaking as her lips pressed against mine. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the beach. Matt's parents showed up the next day around lunch. Matt had apparently been missing since last night. They were worried about him because he hadn't been acting like himself lately. He hadn't been eating well, his sleep had been fitful, and they had often woken up to find him gone at night. Matt's father had found him on our beach many times, curled up in the sand, and they had hoped they'd find him here today. My parents said they hadn't seen him, and I said the same. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't seen him after all. I'd seen the girl, the most beautiful moon child, but any thoughts of my friend had fled my mind after that. They left to see the sheriff, and Mom bemoaned the luck. She asked if I was sure I hadn't seen him last night, and I said that I hadn't. After lunch, I went up and took a nap. I wanted to be fresh for her tonight. I met with her every night that week. I came up after sundown to find her sprawling on the beach waiting for me. We talked for hours, locked in each other's eyes. Her face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and she seemed to hang on my every word. Thinking back, I don't think she spoke much at all. She wanted to hear about my life, my friends, my hobbies, books I'd read, and anything else that mattered to me. She always left at sunrise, kissing me and leaving me dazed and confused. In town, Matt's disappearance was big news. The sheriff had talked to us a few times, wondering if any of us had seen him. The state police were searching everywhere. Every friend he'd ever had, anyone who could have any contact with him, and every place he might have been was searched and searched again. Knowing him to be a swimmer, they were scuba divers combing the ocean, but their hopes were low of finding him if he'd gone into the water. I was in a daze. My waking thoughts were of the girl, the lovely girl, and when I would see her again. Kyle tried to get me to come looking for Matt with them, but I was always too tired. Mom wanted to take me school shopping, but school just didn't interest me. I was in love, I was in lust, and I wanted nothing but my porcelain goddess forever. My haze held until one day when they found Matt. Kyle came slamming into my room, rousing me from sleep and saying we had to go. "What? Kyle, it's too early. I want to sleep." "It's 12:30, dude. Get up and come with me, now." He threw clothes at me as I groggily got out of bed. "What's your damage, man? Why the sudden rush?" "We found him." My blood ran cold. "You found Matt?" "What's left of him. Stewart's got the sheriff, and Roger's staying with the body. I need you to come say your goodbyes before the media circus hits. If you even want to say goodbye." I put my shirt on, glaring at him owlishly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Kyle glared at me. "You're acting just like him before he disappeared. You don't want to hang out. You don't even want to help us look for him. So I'm assuming that you already knew he was missing." "I don't like what you're insinuating," I said, starting to get angry. "You seemed like a good guy when you first moved to town, but now I'm not so sure. You know something. Maybe not all of it, but you know something. Now either come with me or don't, but either way, it's the last time you're ever going to see him. It's also the last time I want to see you." I got dressed and followed him. Matt, it turned out, had washed up on the beach about 5 miles from my house. Well, what was left of him had washed up. His arms and legs were picked over stumps. His eyes and nose were gone, ditto for his lips and ears. If he hadn't still been wearing the t-shirt that Roger had given him for his birthday a year before, no one would have known it was him. He was a torso, picked over from head to toe. When we got there, Stuart and Roger were nearby, both of them crying. The sheriff had shunted the two boys away, and as we approached, he raised a hand to stop us. "No closer, boys. I appreciate you finding the body, but I need you to stand back." Carl told the sheriff how they had found the body while riding along the road. "We were going to the corner store when we saw him. We thought he was a dolphin that had been washed up until we saw the t-shirt. That's when we came to get you. The ambulance came and took the body away." I remember looking at him under that white sheet and still being able to see his eyeless face. I realized I'd been living in a cloud the whole time. I needed to find out what had happened that night, and only one person knew for sure. After dark, I went to find her. She lay waiting for me, the same as always, but when I didn't sit, she seemed worried. "What's wrong, handsome? You seem upset." I took a deep breath. "What happened to Matt the night we met?" "Who?" she asked, but her voice didn't seem right. "My friend, Matt. I think you'd been talking to him just like this before he died. I think he went into the water after you that night, and now his body is sitting in the morgue, half eaten." I took a step back from her. "Handsome, I don't know who this person is. Why don't you come sit with me? You can tell me all about them." She patted the sand, and for a moment I saw a hand the color of algae. I saw a hand with webbed fingers. She must have noticed, because the hand was normal again just that fast. I took another step back. "Why did you save him all those years ago? Why did you save him from drowning if you were just going to kill him?" She looked down, her hair making a sheet in front of her face. "He wasn't ready yet." That sent a shiver through me. Ready? Ready for what? When she looked back up, her face had changed. Her eyes were like onyx stones. Her nose had become a snake's slit. Her teeth were rows of sewing needles, and her grin looked ready to split her full rotten lips. The dress wasn't a dress. It was her shimmering scales, and as she moved, I could see a tail like a carp's attached to her. Her whispery voice was now like a hook dragged across a rock. "We needed his seed. Our men are gone. There's no one to hunt for us. We must make some more. We have to create the next generation." My feet were moving backwards now. "You killed him for his... We needed his seed. We needed his meat. Once we were done, we gave him back," she said, her teeth fixed in a lazy grin. "I don't want to see you anymore," I said. "You're not the person I thought you were." I was 12 feet away, but I heard her final words on the subject. "You can't turn from me, boy. I swim in your veins now. You can't deny me any more than he could." She was right. Even as I walked away, wanting to run, I felt my feet trying to go back to her. I had to make myself go inside. I had to make myself go into my room. I had to make myself close the curtains and try to resist the urge to go back to the beach. Writing this helped, but I can't stop thinking about her, even with my mind so distracted. She's never a monster in my memories. When I think of her, she's always the porcelain moonchild I met on the beach. She's always the sweet girl whose lips were sweeter still. She's always the subject of my infatuation. I peeked out my window several times. She's out on the rock, sitting on the throne, singing to me. Her song is for me alone, and I know that I will go to her despite my best efforts. Even now, I feel like a swim. Even now, I feel myself wanting to swim to her. Even now, I feel myself wanting to see what she has to show me in the deeps. I knew there was no way I could have seen him, but I could swear I saw my old dog, Blue, standing near the fence of Sanders' farm. I work out of town, the town I grew up in being pretty tiny, and I have to pass Sanders' farm anytime I come home from work. Sanders' farm has been a landmark since before I was born, and it grows most of the produce for town. Herschel Sanders runs a very successful produce stand in town and sells crops to grocery stores all over the state. He's a bit of a local celebrity, and he seems to be the only person in town doing well for himself besides Cotton's Antiques. He also owned the farm my parents were supposed to have dropped Blue off to when I was a kid. Blue had been a good dog, a great companion for a kid my age, but maybe a little too rambunctious for my parents' liking. He'd been a mutt with pointy ears, a thick coat of soft brown fur, and a pair of green, inquisitive eyes that never seemed to get tired of darting around for something to chase or catch. I loved him, but for two adults in a small house, we lived in an apartment at the time, he must have been a nightmare. The day he bit Tommy was probably one of the worst days I remember, so, of course, it was indelibly etched in my memory forever. Tommy was a lot older than me or my friends. He was 12, and we all lived in fear of him. Whenever he strode onto the little playground area off the apartment complex, 5'8" and broad in the chest, we all usually left to go play somewhere else. Unfortunately, on that day, I was playing alone on the basketball court, and didn't have time to escape. I'd been shooting baskets. I wanted to join the elementary school basketball league next year, so I wanted to get good. That's when Tommy came striding up. Blue was panting about good-naturedly, but looked up when he saw Tommy coming. He was always alone, never having any chums to play around with, and that should have been a red flag to any adult that had been watching. Even the most brutal of children have someone to pal around with, but Tommy was too antisocial and stupid mean for even other bullies to accept. "What you doing, sissy?" he asked, dragging out his limited insults he reserved for sissies or babies. I told him I was just shooting baskets, and he sneered like that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. "That's not how you get better, stupid. Why don't you play me one-on-one? That'll get you better quicker." I agreed, thinking maybe he had decided to be friendlier. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The game started out with him taking the ball from me and scoring point after point. I was smaller than him, so it was easy for him to steal the ball from me and rack up points while I stumbled around. After a while, I started developing some strategies to get around him, though, and I started making some points on my own. Before I knew it, we were nearly tied, and this was unacceptable to Tommy. The game had been dirty before, but now it was downright brutal. The first time he pushed me, I heard Blue growl a warning. The second time he pushed me, I heard Blue snarl at him. On the third time, his fist coming down to crack me on the side of the head, I heard him yell as Blue sank his teeth into Tommy's backside. Tommy cried out, telling me to get my dog off him. I was shocked. I'd never seen Blue bite anyone. He hung onto the back of his jeans, worrying at him, as Tommy ran off the blacktop towards his house. He let him go as his sneakers left the court, and I laughed about it then, Blue grinning his doggy grin as he came back to rub against my hand. When the police arrived at my house later that day, I didn't think it was so funny. They told us that Tommy's parents had reported a dog bite. Specifically, they had reported that Blue had bitten their son, and now the police had come to take him away. I told them my side of the story, all the while clutching Blue around the neck, but it didn't seem to make any difference to them. A dog had bit, and now he had to be put down. I think Dad saw that I was getting really upset, because he agreed to take Blue to the police station and said he wouldn't let them put him to sleep unless I got to say goodbye. This soothed me a little, but I was still pretty upset as I watched my dog walk away for the last time. When Dad came back, it was already nighttime, but he seemed a little happier. He told me that he had come to an understanding with the police officers, and they had let him drop Blue off at Sanders' farm. Dad said that Mr. Sanders usually took in troubled dogs, or dogs that were going to be put down, and let them work on his farm as farm dogs. That way, Blue could live there, and he wouldn't have to be put to sleep. He'll have all kinds of room to run around, much more room than this little apartment, and he'll be happy, Dad had said. I was ecstatic. I was sad that Blue couldn't live with us anymore, but at least the police wouldn't have to put him to sleep. I asked Dad if we could go visit him sometime, to see how he was doing, and Dad said we would see. I went to bed that night and dreamed about Blue as he ran on the farm, herding sheep and running off crows and enjoying his life now that he had a lot of space to play in. I asked Dad a few times if we could go see Blue, but it never seemed to be a good time. Dad always said things like he didn't want to distract him while he was at work, or he didn't want to make it hard for him to settle in by reminding him about his old family. I understood these things. They made sense, but I really wanted to see Blue again. I remember asking a handful of times, but like most kids, my attention span was pretty limited. I got a new game console that year for Christmas. I made the basketball team, so I had to practice almost every day. I was getting ready to go to middle school, so I was a little worried about that. And after a while, I just sort of forgot about Blue. I never really forgot about him. I still thought about him sometimes, in that vague way that kids often do, but I just stopped asking to go see him. Eventually, I guess I stopped thinking about him. Until today, when I saw him on the fence, I hadn't honestly thought about him in years. I was heading to dinner with my parents after work, so I figured I'd let them know what I'd seen. They might like knowing that Blue was okay, and that he was still living a good life. Mom opened the door for me when I knocked and invited me to help finish fixing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a salad, I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem to understand. The chunk of the knife seemed soothing as it cut the vegetables, and I told her that I'd seen Blue running around the farm where we'd left him. She still seemed a little confused, not really understanding what I was talking about, and when Dad came in, I told him as well. Dad didn't seem confused at all, though. Quite the contrary, he looked a little scared. "You saw Blue at Sanders' farm?" "Yeah, just where you said you dropped him off. He looked really happy. He was running around, chasing birds, and living his best life. He looked up when I drove past and almost seemed to recognize me. I was thinking that I might go visit him, see if he's still..." "Kid," Dad stated, cutting me off. "That's impossible." "I guess you're right," I said, thinking it over as we talked about it. "Blue would have to be 20 years old by now. Maybe it's one of his puppies. It looks just like him. I might stop by anyway, see if maybe Mr. Sanders will sell me one of Blue's puppies. It would be nice to have a reminder of old Blue around the apartment." My dad sat down heavily, and that made me look up at him with real worry. He seemed like he was debating something, or maybe having a hard time accepting something. I was worried for a minute that he might be having a heart attack. He'd had one last year, and after that his heart hadn't exactly been stable. Instead, he just looked up at me like he might have seen a ghost or something. "That's not possible, because Blue is dead." I looked at him in shock. "How do you know? Did Mr. Sanders tell you when he..." "He didn't have to. Blue died the night I took him to the police station. We put him down." My head spun a little. Had they been lying to me this whole time? Dad had told me he'd taken Blue to the farm. He had stuck to that story till eventually I forgot. Had he just been telling me a lie to stop me from being upset? Why had he told me about taking Blue to the farm at all? "Sit down. I think it's time I tell you the truth. It's the truth you may have to face yourself one day, so it's best you hear it now." I sat down, keeping a close eye on my old man, who suddenly seemed less trustworthy than he had a few minutes ago. People in this town always say that they're taking their dogs to the farm. It's been a tradition for at least as long as I can remember. My own dad told me he was taking my dog Scout to Sanders' farm when he got too old and too sick. He said that Scout could run and play for as long as he wanted, and the country air would do him some good. My daddy had never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of, and I was happy that Scout could live somewhere where he could get better. He was old and really sick. I wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to him yet, though. Daddy said we could visit him, but we never did. Eventually, just like you, I kind of forgot about him and went on with my life. I sat in silence, not really sure what to make of all this. So Granddad had lied as well, but this seemed to be a generational lie. Why did so many people use Sanders' farm as a place to leave their dogs? Was it a convenient lie? Or was there more to it? Why did you lie to me?" I asked, still not happy about being misled. "Because I knew that Blue was going to be killed, and I knew that you weren't ready to lose him. Taking him to the farm was just something people tell kids around here. I'd imagine that you have a lot of friends who've had their dogs taken to Sanders' farm over the years. But why? What's the point of it all?" Dad seemed to think about this, weighing his options before settling on, "You'll understand when you're older, when you have kids of your own. Sanders' farm is an important place in this community for many reasons, some of them not quite known even to the people who use it." I didn't end up staying for dinner. I left, despite my mother's protests, and drove home. I don't know why, but I was just so irrationally mad about being lied to. I realized, of course, that my parents had lied like this before. I've lived with the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and even a monster that lived in the basement named Mr. Giles, who would get you if you came downstairs after bedtime. They all turned out to be fake, of course. They were lies they told, but lies that they told gently and only to add magic to my childhood or keep me from doing foolish things. I could understand those lies, but not this one. This one felt different. This one felt personal. I flopped onto the couch when I got home, and John paused his game as he glanced over at me. "What's wrong, babe? You look upset." "It's nothing," I lied, looking away before finally spilling the whole sad story. I was in tears by the end, my boyfriend holding my hands and patting them gently. He'd grown up here too, and had known my parents only slightly less time than I had. He often gave me some perspective on what was going on, and was my voice of reason in many things. "I'm sure your dad had a good reason. He's a good man, and I don't feel like he'd lie to you for no reason. He probably just wanted to protect you. You were 8 after all." He slid his thumbs over the backs of my hands like I liked, and I smiled as I bent forward to kiss his forehead. "Thanks, hon. You always know just what to say." John grinned through his beard and reached for the controller again. Boyfriendly duties now complete. Besides, it's not all that weird if you think about it. I cocked an eye at him. "What do you mean?" "Well, that's where my dad took Russell after he got hit by that car. He told me he took him to Mr. Sanders' farm so he could get better, but I guess he never did." That gave me pause. John had basically told me the same story my dad had, and it was a little too similar for coincidence. As John went back to rolling and smashing anything that wandered into his field of vision, I opened my phone and sent a text to my friend Matt. Matt and I had been friends nearly as long as John and I had, and I trusted him as much as I trusted my boyfriend. "Hey Matt, just wondering if you've ever heard your parents say anything about taking one of your pets to Sanders' farm. Just curious, trying to settle a bet." The last bit would really hook him. He seemed to like making John look dumb by proving him wrong. I watched John play Elden Ring for a few more minutes before my phone buzzed and I picked it up to see his reply. "Wow, that's weird. Yeah, my dad took Snoopy there after he got too old to walk. I haven't thought about that in forever. That's trippy." I thanked him and sent a text to Jane, a friend from work. Jane lived in the next town over, but Kine was still only about 20 minutes from my hometown. I was wondering if this was just a regional thing, or if it extended farther than our little burg. Janet sent back a string of question marks and asked why I needed to know something so weird. I told her it was to settle a bet too, and she told me she'd never had a dog get taken to Sanders' farm. "We always just buried them in the backyard," she said. Okay, so maybe it wasn't particularly far-reaching. For the next few hours, as John cursed and growled at the maddening boss he was trying to beat, I sent text after Facebook message after Twitter message and everything in between to old school friends and people I knew from town to ask them if they'd lost dogs too. John's story about Russell had made me realize this was bigger than just my family, and I wanted to know how far exactly. Of the 10 people I got responses from, 6 said their parents had told them they were taking dogs to Sanders' farm. One friend only had cats growing up, and it appeared that they didn't get to live a happy life on Sanders' farm. The other 2 had never been allowed to have pets, so they'd never had anything to lose. The one person whose dog hadn't gone to Sanders' farm had escaped while the family was on vacation, so the whereabouts of the dog were never discovered. The findings were inconclusive, but they were still pretty damn close. Close enough that as John and I climbed into bed that night, I had already decided that I was going to make a stop on my way home from work tomorrow. The plume of dirt that spewed up behind me as I drove up the long driveway to Sanders' farm was the only bell the old farmer seemed to need. He was waiting for me on the porch with a glass of tea, and a weathered old smile spread across his sunburnt face. "Afternoon, kid. What can I do for you?" We shook hands as I introduced myself, and he handed me the glass of tea as I explained why I was there. Mr. Sanders nodded, asking if I'd like to come inside. He didn't seem surprised by the question at all. Quite the contrary. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to come and ask it all this time. I told him that I thought I'd rather sit on the porch and discuss it, and he nodded as he took a seat in one of the old rockers, indicating that I should take the other. Every now and again, someone puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that everyone brings their dogs to Sanders' farm. It's not a new concept. People have been doing it since before the Great Depression. I can't tell you how long it's been going on, but I can tell you how it started if you'd like to hear. I nodded, and he began his story. The first dog to be brought here wasn't really brought at all. His name was Jip, and he was my friend. He was just a pup when I heard him crying one afternoon. He'd gotten himself stuck in a trap and His pack had deserted him, probably thinking he was done for. He was just a little half-starved thing, but he growled at me as I came to get him loose. Turned out I didn't have to do too much. The trap had nearly tore his front paw off, and he was bleeding out. It seemed a shame to let him die, so I held him down and tied his foot off with a handkerchief. He struggled a lot, snapping and snarling as I tried to stop the bleeding, but eventually he quieted down as the blood oozed out of him and he became less coherent. I scooped him up and took him back home, cutting the little bit of skin off that held his paw on and dressing it as best I could. I was afraid he had died for a little while, but when I heard him come to, snarling and snuffling and howling, I knew he'd likely recover. He smiled as he remembered it, likely thinking of the little wolf pup as he tried to act twice his size. We started off slow, but eventually I earned his trust. His paw would never grow back, but he managed to teach himself to walk with 3 legs. I had done a good enough job of cleaning it up that it didn't get infected, and after a few months, the lack of a paw didn't seem to slow him down. He couldn't return to his pack. I'm not sure he ever even tried, but he was my dog after that, and I loved him. His smile became sad, and I felt we were about to come to the part of the story where he lost that friend. We lived together for about 12 years, both of us growing old as the seasons passed. Jip's gait was slower, and his joints creaked when he walked, but he was still always willing to walk around with me when I did my work. I was in my late 40s, working the land as I do now, when we stumbled upon a bear one day. He had decided to bed down in my corn crib, and when I went down to check my stores, he woke up and charged me. Jip got between us. He was never far from my side, and gave me time to get my rifle. I put the bear down as the 3-legged wolf kept him from attacking me, but the damage was done. Jip had been slashed a dozen times, and I sat with him as he lay bleeding on the dirt floor of my storehouse. Mr. Sanders got a far-off look as he watched the sun sink, seeing far-off days as the sun set over his crops. I buried him in the field, the place he loved the most. I'd built him a house, put him a ratty blanket on the porch, but he seemed to love sleeping amongst the swaying corn plants and amidst the dirt of the field. I buried him there, thinking he might nourish the crops as his spirit lay content, but I never could have foreseen what would happen. That night, I heard a loud barking, a barking that sounded like Jip's. I rushed out with my rifle and found him smiling and barking at the edge of the field, good as new. Behind him, though, the crops had grown 4 times as plentiful. Corn and beans and squash and potatoes, everything else I grew in those days, too. Jip looked at me as though to say, "Thanks for a good life," and then he dove back into the field and I never saw him again. That was how it started. "Well, what started?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "The crops came in, and I brought my wares to the nearest market. I made enough money to build a new barn, buy a new horse, and eat like a king that winter. There had been enough food to stuff my storehouse, and the excess I'd taken to market was more like a normal yield from any other year. The next year I planted as I had every year, and old Jip brought in another bountiful harvest. I bought more land, made plans to plant an orchard, began to think about buying cattle and sheep. I even thought about becoming some kind of land baron in this underdeveloped part of the country. The next 2 years were just as fine, but I was in for a surprise." He coughed a little and asked me if I'd get him a glass of tea from the kitchen. I obliged, moving into the house and taking a glass from the cabinet as I moved to the battered old fridge. I refilled my own as I poured the cold tea into the new glass. I was suddenly very thirsty, and my throat felt dry as a bone. When I brought it back to him, he thanked me before taking a long sip. After 4 years of amazing yield, the 5th year was a disappointment. The crops did well as they ever did before Jip died, but the bounty was nowhere to be seen. I had just begun planting the fruit trees and just started making inquiries about livestock. I worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any of the plans I'd been making, and that temporary success might just slip through my fingers. The next year was much the same, but I had noticed a small decline in the quality of my produce. There had been no blight, no insects to speak of, but the crops seemed weaker, more feeble this year. I began to panic. What would I do if the fields stopped making? What could I do if the vegetables stopped coming? I tried different things that spring to rejuvenate the fields. I bought tonics from a traveling man. I put down fertilizer. I tried increasing the water I gave the fields. The fertilizer, however, had made me remember that I had used something very different to fertilize the land 4 years ago, and that made me wonder if doing so might rejuvenate the fields again. The sun was sinking lower now, the fiery ring just over the tops of the corn as they waved merrily. And so I set out to find a proper sacrifice for the land, something to bring it back again. I tried forest animals. Jip had been of the forest after all, but to no avail. I tried strays from the nearby town, but they did nothing. In my desperation, I'm ashamed to say that I bought and killed animals from the local stableman, even going so far as to buy and slaughter a horse, but they did little to rejuvenate the crop. Then one evening, as I came back from the market with my pathetic yield, I nearly struck a child as he came bounding into the road. The dog with him, just an average mutt, pushed him out of the way, and my tires crunched over the animal. I heard the boy cry out in despair as he cradled the dying dog in his arms. Its back was clearly broken, but I wasted no time. I took the dog with me, driving away quickly as the father came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. The setting sun cut fire lines across his eyes, and the sting must have been uncomfortable, if not eye-watering. Mr. Sanders seemed not to notice, though. He was dead by the time I arrived home, and I buried him in the field, as I had with Jip. The crops came back, the land thrived, and I think that was when I realized what the land wanted. The old dog had been loved, just as Jip had been loved, and that love seemed to nourish the land like nothing else. From that day on, I seemed to always have my eyes peeled for dogs. The sick ones could sometimes be taken off the owner's hands, but I had been known to buy them from struggling families as well. As the years went by and the town grew, so too did my prosperity. I was one of the largest farmers in the region. My produce sold at every general store and market for miles around. I've seen the horses replaced by automobiles, seen the carts that came to get my food replaced by trucks, and all the while, my fields continue to put out more of the stuff I needed to grow. But there was a price, and the price has become quite steep over the years. I was still mulling over what he had said, and when he paused to drain the dregs of his glass, I asked the question that had been wavering on the edge of my mind. "Mr. Sanders, how old are you?" Mr. Sanders fixed me with a mischievous grin, and it took years off of him. "Just starting to put it together, eh? I was born in 1815. I bought this land in 1845. The year I buried Jip, I was 45, and I have stayed that age ever since. Despite having more crops than I know what to do with, the land also grants me life for my sacrifice. I can't explain why, and I can't explain how, but I keep living as long as the land thrives." I wanted to deny what he was saying, but I could find no argument against it. The man looked old, sun-weathered, but not ancient. How would he manage to keep from being noticed? If he had really owned this farm for so long, how had no one seen? As my farm grew, so too did the town. The market thrived, the people prospered, and thus began the agreement. I had grown tired of finding my own sacrifices, so I made them a deal. They would bring me their dogs, those who were sick or those who were too old to carry on, and I would continue to make the town flourish. By that time, I was making a sacrifice once a month. Today, I make a sacrifice once a day. Before too long, I fear that it will become unmanageable, and the farm will fail." I said nothing, just sitting and staring, wishing I could believe that this man was crazy. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. I've grown tired of living and making sacrifices, and maybe it's finally time to rest. Nothing lasts forever after all, not even immortality," he said, grinning. The grin made his face look skeletal, his true age shining through at last. I thanked him for the tea, thanked him for the story, and stood up shakily. "Take care of yourself, kid, and don't worry. Old Blue is as happy as any other dog here. You did what you could for him, and now he's at rest where no one can hurt him ever again." I nodded dumbly, my legs shivering as I walked down the stairs to my car. As I climbed in, I thought I saw a familiar brown snout as it poked from the rows of corn plants. My hands froze halfway to the ignition. He was grinning at me, looking out through the corn and panting happily. It was as if he had come back one last time to say goodbye, and as we locked eyes, he slid slowly back into the field. I've driven by that farm once a day since, but I've never seen Blue again. I do worry, though, about what will happen to all those ghosts if something should happen to Sanders' farm. The crops have begun to look a little different lately, less healthy, more like plants that are rotting from the inside. If the vegetables die, if the farm fails, then what will happen to all those spirits that call the land their home? There was a sign next to the dirt road today that said, "For sale by owner." I suppose soon we may very well find out.